What's good everybody, this is CP and welcome back to another fantasy basketball video. Just a quick disclaimer here, do not blindly follow all the information I'm about to share in this video. Like everybody else, I could be completely wrong. So the most important thing to do is do your own research and make your own final decisions. So let's not waste any more time and 走起吧. For amazing luck in fantasy basketball this year, make sure you like this video within the next 5 seconds. I wouldn't risk it. So last time I took a look at some very important fantasy categories including scoring, points, and triples. And I predicted some potential top scorers and dark horse candidates you might want to go after this year to help your teams win. So if you haven't watched that video yet, make sure you watch that after this one, cause it might give you that little extra edge you need to win it all in your fantasy leagues this year. Now for this video, I'll deep dive into a few more major fantasy categories, starting with assists. So the leaders from last year, we had Westbrook, Chris Paul, Jokic, Trae Young, and Luka Doncic rounding out the top 5. And out of everyone here, I feel like Westbrook might actually take a step back fantasy-wise this year since he's joining the Lakers and is playing alongside another ball-dominant player in LeBron James who should impact Westbrook's fantasy stats. So realistically, I wouldn't be surprised to see Westbrook assist numbers go down by maybe 1 or 2 assists per game. Also, James Harden is another player whose stats might decline in this category. As we all know, he's now a member of the Brooklyn Nets and is sharing the ball with Kyrie and KD. So there are huge question marks as to who out of the 3 will come out on top this year fantasy-wise, as I have a feeling that they might handcuff each other's fantasy potential from reaching their ceiling. Overall, from the stats, you can see that it's very hard to find a player who can average over 8.5 assists per game. And in fact, there were only 6 players who were able to do that last year. So even though names like Draymond Green, Ja Morant, and TJ McConnell might not be the most well-rounded fantasy players in the world, I still feel like they hold value if you want to build your team around assists. In terms of upside, out of everyone in the top 10 from last year, I would say Ja Morant is a name that you might want to look out for, as he's still very young and developing as a playmaker in the NBA. I don't think he has fully reached his potential and still might be 2 to 3 years away from reaching his prime. However, if you do decide to go all in on Ja Morant, do realize that he's not the most well-rounded fantasy player. Besides providing really good value in assists, he's not a great shooter from the line and from beyond the arc. His scoring is also just okay and could be a lot better. And based on all the stats we have seen, unless he significantly improves this year, it's hard to see him crack the top 30 overall fantasy player ranks. At the same time, Morant's rebounding and defensive stats are also below average, so don't expect him to carry your fantasy teams in those categories as well. Nikola Jokic is also a rare fantasy player, as last year he was the only center in the NBA who also finished in the top 10 in assists. So in deeper leagues, if you pair Jokic with another high assist guard, your team might be very dominant in that category. Going further down the list and analyzing the stats, you can see that the majority of players in the top 20 for assists are also top 80 to top 100 fantasy players in most standard leagues. Since assist is kind of a rare stat, I would argue that if I'm torn between 2 players with similar stats, I would likely take the one with more potential to give me higher assist numbers per game. Because if I do miss out on drafting assists, it will be really hard to find that on the waiver wire. Out of players who finished in the top 30 in this category last year, I feel like names like LaMelo Ball, Darius Garland, and Fred VanVleet will improve, as all 3 are still in the process of getting better and are all in pretty good fantasy situations that can give them a chance to set new career highs this year. Subscribe. Moving on to another major fantasy category, let's take a look at steals. From analyzing the stats along with assists, I would say that this is one of the rarest categories in fantasy basketball. As you can see, Jimmy Butler of the Miami Heat was the only player who averaged over 2 steals per game last year. Besides that, only 4 players in the entire NBA averaged over 1.6 steals per game. So even though names like TJ McConnell, Draymond Green aren't great scorers and might not help you in a lot of other areas, but they might be very valuable to teams that want to build around assists and steals because they're very hard to find. And I did go back and take a look at the stats from the past few seasons, and overall I would say everyone you see in the top 20 should be pretty safe picks to give you good numbers in steals once again this year. Furthermore, the Ball brothers LaMelo and Lonzo are likely the ones with good upside to improve, as they're still young and have guaranteed minutes as starters on their respective teams this season. Another young player I like in this category is Tyrese Halliburton of the Sacramento Kings, who I think might be a good sleeper to go after, as he finished just outside of the top 20 in steals last season with 1.3 per game. If he continues to improve, I feel like he has an outside shot to be a top 15 players in this category by the end of next season. And based on all the stats I've looked at, I would argue that most players averaging over 1.3 steals per game shouldn't be left on the waiver wire for too long, as steals is just too hard to find later on in the season. So worst case scenario, if you don't want to roster that player that you picked up with a high steal count, it could be a good selling point for you to package them in a deal to upgrade your team in other areas. Moving on to blocks, this is another rare fantasy category that many of you I feel like should pay attention to. Miles Turner was the only player who averaged over 3 blocks per game last year. In fact, I believe Turner and Rudy Gobert has been the mainstay in the top 4 for this category for the past 2 to 3 years. So those two are likely considered the cream of the crop once again this season. So in my opinion, if you take either Gobert or Turner, you would give your team a huge head start in the blocks department, especially if you play in a points league where blocks are worth a lot. Naturally, by looking at the list, you can see that most of the players in the top 20 for blocks last year are either centers or power forwards. One more thing to keep in mind is that elite shot blockers are usually not the best scorers in fantasy basketball, because out of everyone in the top 10 besides Clint Capella, I don't think anyone averaged more than 15 points per game last season. Meanwhile, a name like Robert Williams was a newcomer in this category last year, and as his role continues to grow in Boston, I believe he could be one of the biggest risers for this category. Going further down the list, I think a name like Isaiah Stewart of the Detroit Pistons will continue to get better. And in my books, he's a dark horse candidate to move up into the top 10 for blocks this year. Besides that, the stats show it's very hard to find a top 20 overall fantasy player who can also give you really good numbers in blocks. If you're looking for that, I feel like from last year's stats, the best bets are either Giannis or Joel Embiid. But once again, these two names have major deficiencies in their fantasy games, as Giannis isn't a great shooter at the charity stripe and his volume at the line could give you no choice but to punt free throws. Meanwhile, it's been well documented, but injuries is always a concern for Joel Embiid. He's an amazing fantasy player when he's 100% healthy, but when his injuries comes up, he's honestly one of the most frustrating fantasy players to own. So do definitely keep that in mind if you do plan to risk it all with Embiid this year.